What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers held on to some territories even till today, and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even be regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in the short story collection The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Blue Corn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. Father Hidalgo is considered to be the first leader in Mexico's independence war. Hidalgo was Criollo, of all Spanish ancestry, but his cry for freedom created a movement almost entirely native and mestizo, mixed race. His army grew to almost 100,000, mostly without military training, and many of them poorly armed. Some described them as a mob. This army did commit one massacre of Criollo elites that caused some Criollos who favored independence to change and side with Spain. Spanish propaganda created hysteria about their brutality, greatly exaggerating one massacre into a series of them. Hidalgo's army fought 2 Spanish armies and defeated them, but with heavy losses. This likely is the reason Hidalgo hesitated to attack Mexico City. He went around it, and his army shrunk to 40,000 from desertions. A Spanish army defeated him. He was captured and then executed by torture. With Criollos now mostly siding with Spain, independence took another decade. When it finally came, it was led by a Criollo general, Agustin Iturbide, who declared himself emperor. Mexico's new nation would be dominated by entirely white European ancestry elites, all the way to the present. Only one of its presidents has been native. Its generals, politicians, businessmen, even its entertainment celebrities are overwhelmingly white, and most of its leaders have been corrupt, sometimes stealing millions in office. As for Mexico's natives and mixed-race people, Mexico's white-dominated government tried forced assimilation. Only a third of Mexico's people spoke Spanish at independence. The church protected native lands. Mexico's government used assimilation successfully enough that today only from 1/6 to 1/10 of its people identify as native, and Indio is considered an insult. The church's power was restricted, even persecuted in the 1930s. Natives lost most of their land, becoming landless workers for white plantation owners. But what if Hidalgo's army crushes Spanish elites in Mexico City? What if he did not hesitate and lost many recruits and then be defeated in battle. One key difference might be if Ignacio Allende was the military commander. Hidalgo and Allende had both been part of a Criollo group conspiring for independence. Allende was a military commander. Hidalgo, as a priest, had no such training. Allende would have a much better chance of defeating Spanish armies. Would there be a massacre of Criollo elites in Mexico City? Hard to say. Allende may prevent it. Either way, the taking of Mexico City means independence. It also means a true social revolution, much like happened almost 100 years later, and not just independence. Criollos lose most of their power. There will be no forced assimilation. There will not be huge native land loss. And other wars of independence in Latin America happen sooner and are more likely to be social revolutions too, overthrowing white domination in the colonies. More than that, there will not be over a decade more of fighting Spain. Spain would certainly invade again, but will be defeated far more easily with no local support. There will also not be decades of fighting between white elites seeking power. The worst of them, General Santana, seized power almost a dozen times, only to resign when he was bored from lack of wars to fight. Earlier independence and a Mexico run by mestizos and natives means a united Mexico that can defeat later U.S. invasions. There will be no American colonists and American illegal immigrants who try to take over Texas. There will be no U.S. pretext for a war with Mexico. It would have to be openly a war for slavery and slave states, which would be far less popular in America. If a U.S.-Mexico war does happen, it will not be as one-sided as in our own time. It will be a hard war, and perhaps the U.S. gives up, just as it did in the Seminole War. The U.S. losing the U.S.-Mexico War means the gold rush happens in Mexico, not the U.S. The gold rush strengthens Mexico. Mexico becomes a Pacific Coast power, much more than the U.S. The U.S. is also likely to have a civil war much sooner, since there will be no more slave states, but there will be many free northern states. A U.S. occupied with its civil war will leave Mexico alone for at least a decade, and by that time, Mexico will be wealthier and more industrial. If there's no gold rush with California under U.S. rule, there will be no California Indian genocide. California will be much more native without the up to 300,000 deaths by genocide. Likely, California is still today half native and half mostly mestizo Mexican, with some Asians and a small number of whites coming as much from Europe as from the U.S. It's also likely Mexico will never be ruled by dictator Porfirio Diaz. He would remain just one more general in a mostly native and mestizo-ruled Mexico. Diaz, more than any other elite, impoverished Mexico, especially its natives, taking away their land and their rights. No Diaz means no Mexican Revolution that killed and displaced millions, mostly to the U.S. The U.S. would have a much smaller Latino population. Mexico is more likely to be the nation that fights Spain to liberate Cuba and Puerto Rico, not the U.S. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if Brazil is many nations.